My daughter, no, she's just the plus one. My mother didn't even turn her head. She flicked her chin toward me and kept talking to the gate guard. 20 years wearing a uniform, and she's still nothing but a desk clerk pushing papers. Not exactly someone worth introducing. Just swipe her card and let's move this along. She didn't look at me, but the guard did. His flashlight hit my card. The beam stopped on the gold seal. Blood left his face. All of it. He stumbled back, slammed his heels together, crack, and snapped to attention so hard his whole body locked rigid. He lunged into the booth, grabbed the red phone, and screamed, "Alert, we have an admiral at the gate. I repeat, a flag officer is on site." My mother laughed, told him he'd lost his mind. She didn't know that 30 years of playing invisible had just officially ended. But before I tell you why, that night was the only night in 3 decades they truly saw me, and who ended up paying the price. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and don't go anywhere. Because what happened next, nobody in that car saw coming. The year I turned 10, my father, a Navy ship welder, whose knuckles were permanently black with grease, dropped a chunk of bent steel, shaped like an anchor, onto our kitchen table, hard enough to crack the formica. He planted his fists on either side of it and declared, "Only things you can hold in your hand have any value." No church, no scripture, that was the only religion in our house. I was standing 3 feet away, clutching a certificate so tightly the corners had gone soft and damp. First place at the county science fair. I'd built a scale model of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer out of scrap metal solder and 6 weeks of staying up past midnight in the garage. I held it up. My father's eyes swept over it, found no raw steel worth gripping, and he shrugged. Just shrugged one shoulder, lifting and dropping like a piston, and walked away. He didn't say a single word about the ship, the prize, or the 6 weeks. 3 seconds later, Grant kicked the back door open. He was 8 years old, still had baby fat on his cheeks, and he was holding a gold-plated plastic trophy above his head with both hands like an Olympic torch. Junior track and field. 3rd place in the 50-yard dash. My mother launched herself across the kitchen, wrapped Grant in a bear hug, and shrieked so loud the neighbor's German shepherd started howling through the fence. She kissed his forehead. She kissed the trophy. She put it on top of the refrigerator center stage where the whole family could admire it. I stood outside the frame. I was always outside the frame. That pattern of invisibility became a death sentence at 16, the day of my father's funeral. Grant, the golden boy, the athlete, the one whose participation ribbons covered an entire wall, collapsed into my mother's arms at the church and sobbed with the theatrical precision of someone who knew every camera was pointed at him. The whole family circled around him. Uncles squeezed his shoulders. Aunts called him the man of the house now. He got all the grief and all the spotlight, even in death. I didn't cry. I stood behind a support column with a borrowed flip phone and a legal pad, settling $6,300 in hospital invoices, arguing with the funeral home about the overcharge on the casket rental, scheduling the hearse route, confirming the cemetery plot number. That night, while Grant slept in my mother's bed like a child, I sat at the kitchen table until 4 in the morning, handwriting 61 thank you cards in my neatest cursive to every single person who had attended. I arranged them in 4 perfect rows on the counter and went to sleep on the couch for 90 minutes. At 6 a.m., my mother swept all 61 cards off the counter and into the trash can with one arm, didn't read a single one, didn't pause, didn't even break stride on her way to the coffee pot. "Clear off this table. I need room to display Grant's trophies properly. Nobody reads thank you cards, Emily." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper and swallowed it. At 18, I carried my Naval Academy scholarship letter home in an envelope I'd pressed flat with an iron because I wanted it to look perfect when she opened it. Full ride, 4 years. One of 27 women selected from 11,000 applicants. I had spent 3 months training for the physical fitness test alone, running 5 miles every morning before school in the dark, doing push-ups on the concrete floor of the garage until my arms gave out. I placed it on the table and waited with my hands behind my back, parade rest, as if presenting an award to a superior officer. My mother was filing her nails. She stopped, picked up the envelope with the tips of 2 fingers like it might be contaminated, scanned the first line, and gave me a look that could have stripped paint off a hull. The Navy. "So they're going to teach you how to file paperwork for free. I just pray you don't bury yourself in some godforsaken outpost and embarrass this family more than you already do." Grant sprawled across the couch with a game controller welded to his palms, snorted through his nose a thin nasal laugh that carried no humor, only contempt. I should have screamed. Flipped the table, told her the acceptance rate was lower than Harvard's. But the brain of a future naval officer was already running calculations that had nothing to do with emotion. I remembered Admiral McRaven's commencement words, "Make your bed," and never ring the bell. I made a strategic decision that would cost me the next 30 years of my life. I would shrink. I would compress myself into the smallest possible volume so my mother could orbit around Grant without my shadow getting in the way. I folded the scholarship letter in half, stuffed it into my backpack, and yanked the zipper shut with a single sharp pull. The metallic teeth grinding closed, that was my oath. I locked my pride inside a bag and left it there. I turned, walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, and did not shed a single tear. I began a 30-year campaign of voluntary disappearance. 40 meters below the surface of the Persian Gulf at 0:30, the water wrapped around my body like wet cement. Visibility 18 inches. Temperature barely above hypothermia threshold. I regulated my heart at 60 beats per minute, not because I was calm, but because the device strapped to the foreign ship's hull 3 feet from my face would detonate if it detected vibration above a certain frequency. One tremor in my fingers and my dive team would become a debris field. I positioned the cutting tool around the detonation circuit. 3 pounds of pressure. Steady. I severed the wire. The LED on the device went from red to black. Death powered down. I broke the surface, ripped off the oxygen mask, and gasped in night air that tasted like diesel fuel and salt. Sea wind lashed across my face hard enough to make my eyes water. I ran my tongue across my lower lip and tasted blood. The pressure differential had cracked the skin from the inside. In this world, the world of explosive ordnance disposal at the tip of American foreign policy, I was the one they called when the math said nobody would survive. Out here, I wasn't invisible. I was everything. I hauled myself over the gunwale of the destroyer and landed on deck plating that vibrated like a tuning fork. Before I could strip my dive gear, the communications officer jogged over and pushed my personal cell phone into my wet glove. The satellite had finally caught a signal. One notification glowed on the cracked screen. A text from my mother. Grant needs $15,000 for a Porsche deposit, ASAP. His partners need to see class before they sign. Wire it now, you're at sea anyway, not like you have anywhere to spend it. She texted a financial demand the same way someone sends a pizza order. No greeting, no question about how I was. Completely oblivious to the fact that 10 minutes earlier, I'd been nose to nose with a weapon designed to kill everything within a 200-meter radius. The bleeding had been going on for years. It started small, a utility bill here, a car repair there, and metastasized into something monstrous. My mother's boutique investment fund cratered after she poured $60,000 into a vineyard partnership run by a man she'd met at a charity auction. I covered the losses. Grant reinvented himself as a defense industry consultant. No clearance, no credentials, no contracts, just a leased office in a glass tower and a wardrobe that cost more per month than a junior enlisted sailor's annual salary. I financed the entire performance. When his first fake venture collapsed, I wired $40,000 to keep creditors from filing. When his second one stalled, I covered the rent on his office for 8 months. Bethany, his wife, redecorated their house twice in 3 years, using my deployment pay as a decorating budget. Nobody thanked me. Nobody even asked how I was. The money simply appeared in their accounts the way oxygen appears in a room, invisible, taken for granted, missed only when it stops. I systematically drained my hazard pay, the supplemental compensation the Navy issues specifically, because there is a statistically meaningful chance you will die during your next shift, and routed it into their bank accounts through automatic transfers I'd set up to avoid the indignity of being asked repeatedly. The total over 15 years exceeded $400,000. Money earned at the bottom of oceans, inside blast zones, in the dark. Money that smelled like salt water and C4 and blood. I logged into the banking app, typed the password with wet, salt-crusted fingers. The balance dropped. But the number on the screen was not the poison. The poison was that they cashed every cent while still believing completely, absolutely, without a flicker of doubt, that I was a low-level clerk who answered phones in a windowless office somewhere. Transfer confirmed. Screen went dark. Immediately, my executive officer crossed the deck at a run, reporting hostile surface contacts approaching the maritime exclusion zone. I pushed the phone deep into my chest pocket, sealed off every personal emotion, the way you seal watertight doors on a flooding ship, compartment by compartment, until nothing gets through. General quarters, all hands to battle stations. Route 3,000 sailors to firing positions. My voice was steel on steel. I issued combat orders to a fleet while my mother waited for a Porsche deposit. I kept feeding their fantasy to maintain a peace I was starting to realize had never actually existed. But somewhere behind the sealed doors inside my chest, a detonator had just armed itself. Thanksgiving 2023. Grant wore an Italian three-piece suit, charcoal gray peak lapels, pocket square folded into a crown, all purchased on my dime. He positioned himself at the head of the table before anyone else sat down, poured himself wine from the most expensive bottle, and held court. For 45 minutes, he delivered a monologue about defense contracts, global security consulting, and his personal connections inside the Pentagon, pausing only to chew or to accept my mother's adoring gaze from across the table. Then he raised his glass and aimed his voice at the entire room. I'm advising the Pentagon on strategic acquisitions right now. Admiral Mitchell, the one running naval operations, had to call me last Tuesday for my professional opinion. He said the name the way you'd mention a neighbor. Casual, familiar. As if a flag officer were someone who borrowed his lawnmower on weekends. Grant kept going, emboldened by the silence around the table. Mitchell and I are working on a classified naval defense project. Can't say too much, obviously, but let's just say when the contract closes, we're talking 9 figures. He winked at Bethany, who nodded along with the glazed smile of someone who'd rehearsed this dinner theater in advance. Uncle Ray whistled. Aunt Donna clutched her chest. The cousins leaned forward in their seats like they were watching a movie. The instant the name Mitchell hit my eardrums, a piece of turkey lodged sideways in my throat. I kept my face blank, but behind my eyes something shifted into a gear that had nothing to do with family dinner. Admiral Mitchell, the man Grant was casually name-dropping to impress a roomful of suburban relatives, reported directly to me. I was his commanding officer. 48 hours earlier, Mitchell had stood at rigid attention in a classified operations center aboard a carrier strike group, saluted, and requested my authorization to proceed with a mine-clearing operation in contested international waters. He called me ma'am. He waited until I nodded before he moved. The classified project Grant was fabricating at this dinner table didn't exist. Mitchell's actual classified work involved explosive ordnance disposal corridors that I personally oversaw, corridors that had nearly killed me twice in the past 18 months. I gripped my fork handle until the tendons in my wrist went white. I ran tactical breathing, 4 counts inhale, 4 counts hold, 4 counts exhale, the same pattern I use when I'm working a live device and my hands need to be surgical. It was the only thing standing between me and flipping that Thanksgiving table onto its back. My mother radiated. She reached across the cranberry sauce and stroked Grant's arm like she was petting a thoroughbred. Then she swiveled toward me. Her eyes went flat and sharp the way they always did when she needed a target. See, Emily. Your brother works with admirals. You're still stapling papers in some basement somewhere. Maybe if you ask nicely, Grant can pull some strings and get you a janitorial position at the Pentagon. Every person at that table laughed. Uncle Ray, Aunt Donna, the cousins. Even Grant's wife Bethany covered her smile with her napkin. They were laughing at the person who commanded the operational authority to deploy or withdraw their country's naval forces in an active theater of war. I did not react. Verbal resistance is ammunition wasted on armored ignorance. I lifted my water glass, not wine, never wine, on a night when I needed my faculties, and studied Grant's face the way I'd scan a minefield. Sector by sector. Measuring. Recording. I swallowed the blood pooling against my molars and allowed one micro-expression to cross my lips, a smile so cold it belonged in a morgue. Yes, Mother. Grant has very impressive connections. I logged every lie into the mental dossier I'd been building for 3 years. I was no longer enduring a family dinner. I was conducting reconnaissance for a campaign that would leave nothing standing. The detonator for that campaign presented itself a few months later during a visit home at the start of the new year. I walked into my mother's kitchen, and my eyes caught a flash of cream-colored paper in the trash can, half buried under coffee grounds and eggshells. The embossed Navy seal on the envelope was unmistakable. I'd seen it on 1,000 official documents. I reached in and pulled it out. The recipient line was printed in bold government typeface, Rear Admiral Emily Burke. Inside was an engraved invitation on heavy cardstock, guest of honor and keynote speaker at the Global EOD Gala, the single most prestigious event in the explosive ordnance disposal community worldwide. Admirals attend, senators attend, allied heads of military attend. The invitation had been mailed to my mother's address because my personnel record still listed it as my home of record from 2 decades ago. I held the invitation up to the kitchen light, brushing dried coffee residue off the gold lettering with my thumb. My mother breezed past, snatched the card out of my hand without breaking stride, and curled her lip into the sneer I'd memorized before I could drive. I threw that out for a reason. It's a scam. They print fake military titles on the envelope to trick gullible people into opening them. You answer phones for a living, Emily. What on earth would you be doing receiving an invitation addressed to an admiral? She tossed it back toward the trash. It missed and landed on the floor face up, the words, Rear Admiral, staring at the ceiling. 30 years of reinforced emotional armor fractured down the center line. What happened next made it worse. My mother pulled up a VIP ticket on her phone. She'd spent weeks manipulating a retired colonel's wife in her book club to secure it, and announced that she and Grant would be attending the very same gala so Grant could network with defense investors. Then she pointed one acrylic-tipped finger at me and issued her orders. You'll wear something dark and plain. You'll carry my bag. You'll walk 3 steps behind me. And you will not speak to anyone unless spoken to. First, I will not have you embarrassing me in front of generals. On the night of the gala, I did not put on my uniform. I pulled my hair into a tight bun, regulation tight, the kind that gives you a headache after 6 hours but keeps every strand in place. I chose a dark, modest dress. I slipped my common access card, the one with the gold flag officer seal, deep into my handbag, beneath the lining where my mother would never think to look. I climbed into the passenger seat of her car. The scent of her perfume drugstore brand, applied with the subtlety of a fire extinguisher, saturated the cabin. Grant lounged in the back seat, scrolling through his phone, laughing at something that was probably a meme about money. I locked my jaw, sealed my expression into the blank mask I wear in the final 60 seconds before I give a weapons-free order. Tonight, I would not steer. I would let my mother pilot her own ship at full speed into a reef she couldn't see. 5 p.m. The car rolled to a stop at the entry control point. My mother thrust her phone toward the windshield, waving the VIP ticket and rattling off names of colonels she'd Googled during the drive. The gate guard, young crew cut 6 months out of boot camp, ignored her. He leaned down and aimed his maglite through the passenger window at me. Standard procedure check every occupant. My mother let out an exasperated huff. She's just the +1. 20 years in a uniform and she's still a desk jockey stamping forms. Swipe her through, she's nobody worth holding us up for. My silence ended right there. I extended my common access card through the open window. The flashlight beam tracked across the laminate, past my photograph, stopped on the gold flag officer seal. I watched the transformation happen in real time. The guard's pupils dilated, his jaw slackened. The blood retreated from his face the way a tide retreats, before a tsunami, all at once, leaving nothing behind but pale, exposed ground. He rocked backward, then some deep, drilled-in reflex took control of his body. His heels drove into the pavement with a crack so loud my mother flinched. His posture snapped vertical. His hand rocketed to his temple. He spun on his heel, threw himself through the booth door, and ripped the red phone off the wall. The words came out at a volume that echoed off every surface within 100 meters. Alert, we have an admiral at the gate. I repeat, a flag officer is on site requesting protocol escort immediately. My mother laughed a high, disbelieving cackle. She leaned across me and shouted toward the booth. Stand down, soldier, you've made a mistake. She's just my daughter, a file clerk. There's been a mix-up with the card. The booth door opened for a second time. Master Chief Petty Officer Leon Briscoe stepped out into the floodlights. Leon, the man I'd personally dragged from a burning ordnance disposal pit in Iraq in 2009, hauling him across 40 meters of rubble with shrapnel embedded in my left forearm. The man who had sworn on a hospital gurney in Landstuhl that he would spend the rest of his career making sure anyone who served with me knew exactly who I was. His face tanned leather, creased by sun, and blast concussions transformed the instant he recognized me. A grin broke across it like dawn breaking across a flight deck. He marched to the passenger side, stopped precisely 6 feet away, and delivered a salute that could have been photographed for a recruiting poster. Admiral Burke, ma'am, it is an absolute honor. The fleet has been awaiting our guest of honor all evening. We have an escort standing by. The oxygen inside the car evaporated. My mother's hands fused to the steering wheel. Her knuckles transitioned from pink to chalk white in under 2 seconds. I could hear her breathing change, shallow, fast, the respiratory pattern of someone whose entire reality has just been carpet-bombed. In the back seat, Grant made a sound I'd never heard from a human being before. A wet, strangled rattle like a man choking on his own disbelief. I spoke. Low, measured. the voice of a commanding officer who has spent a career issuing orders that decide whether people live or die. At ease, Master Chief. It's good to see you're still standing. I reached for the door handle, my mother did not move, to help could not move, and opened my own door. I stepped onto the pavement, straightened the hem of my dress, and looked back through the car window at the two people who had spent 30 years calling me invisible. I said nothing more. I turned, squared my shoulders, and walked through the checkpoint and into the grand hall without looking back. Behind me, my mother sat frozen, her key stuck in the ignition, her mouth open, unable to produce a single sound. If you've ever bitten down on your own tongue and swallowed your pride to keep a fake peace with a family that never saw your worth, hit that like button and share your story in the comments below. Because the payback I delivered next will speak for every single one of you who was never given the respect you earned. The ballroom doors opened and I walked into a wall of white. 1,000 naval officers in full-dress whites rose from their seats simultaneously. The sound of 1,000 chairs pushing back across marble was like a wave breaking against a seawall. The fleet commander, a 4-star admiral with more campaign ribbons than chess base, crossed the floor to greet me. He took my hand in both of his and held it. Emily, we've been looking forward to this all year. I climbed the stairs to the podium. Behind me, a projection screen displayed my official service photograph alongside the words, Guest of Honor Rear Admiral Emily Burke, EOD. The photograph was 20 feet tall. My mother was sitting 40 feet away from it. Under the chandeliers, I swept the room the way I sweep a target area, systematic, methodical, missing nothing. I found them. My mother and Grant squeezed into seats at a back corner table, their name placards handwritten in last-minute cursive because they'd barely made the guest list. Their faces were the color of wet newsprint. My mother's mascara had already started to run. Grant sat rigid, his expensive Italian suit suddenly looking cheap under the ballroom lights. His jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching from the stage. The man who'd spent Thanksgiving telling the family that Admiral Mitchell calls him for advice was now surrounded by the real military professionals he'd been impersonating for years, and not a single one of them knew his name or cared to learn it. I delivered my keynote. The hall went silent, not polite audience silent, but combat briefing silent, the kind of quiet where you could hear a pin hit carpet from across the room. I spoke about the men and women who clear the path through darkness so others can walk safely in daylight. I spoke about sacrifice that asks for no audience and courage that operates without applause. I spoke about the soldiers who volunteer for the missions nobody else will take, the ones who crawl toward the device while everyone else runs the other direction, and how their families sometimes never learn to understand the weight of that choice. Then my gaze locked onto my mother's position in the back corner, and my voice dropped half an octave, sharpened to a cutting edge. Silence is not a tragedy. It is the mission. As long as you are the one who chooses to walk in the dark, not someone who was forced to become invisible by the very people who should have seen them first. My mother's head dropped. She stared at her own lap for the remainder of the evening. Grant didn't move. He sat frozen in a room full of uniforms he had never earned, and for the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely nothing to say. After the final toast, Colonel Priya Anand intercepted me in a side corridor. Priya, the woman who had pulled me out of a collapsed structure in Kandahar 17 years ago, slapped my helmet when I wanted to quit and told me I was too stubborn to die, stood blocking the hallway with her arms crossed and her jaw set. Her eyes held equal parts fury and grief. Let me make sure I understand what just happened tonight. You allowed your mother to drive the guest of honor through a military checkpoint in the passenger seat. You sat there while she told a United States sailor, your sailor, that you were nobody. You let her call you trash in uniform in front of your own subordinates, and you absorbed it like it was normal. She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the gunpowder-scented cologne she'd worn since our days in Kabul. I watched you disarm a daisy chain IED in a sandstorm without flinching, Emily. But your mother says one cruel sentence, and you fold like a recruit on day one. How long? How much more blood and rank are you going to hand over to people who use you as a cash machine and spit on the receipt? The words hit me the way a flashbang hits a dark room. All light, all at once, nowhere to hide. I had spent 30 years disguising cowardice as humility, dressing up fear as discipline, calling self-destruction a sacrifice. Priya was right. Absorbing psychological violence from people who are supposed to love you is not strength. It is self-erasure performed willingly over and over until there's nothing left to erase. I refused the ride home with my mother. I called a military staff car, black government plates, and climbed into the back seat alone. The leather was cold. The city scrolled past in silence. In the darkness, staring at the headlights of oncoming traffic, I issued a new operational order. Not to a fleet, not to a squadron, but to myself. Terminate all supply lines. Effective immediately. No exceptions, no negotiations, no mercy. In the back of the staff car, blue light from my phone screen painted shadows across my hands. I opened the banking application and scrolled. The screen filled with automatic transfers, monthly wires to my mother's household account, quarterly payments to Grant's business credit line, annual lump sums to cover insurance premiums on a Porsche I'd never sat in. Each transaction was a blood transfusion. Each one kept their illusion breathing. I did not hesitate. I operated the way I operate on a live device, cold sequencing, zero emotion, irreversible actions taken in the correct order. I pressed cancel. Again. 12 transactions, each one a severed artery. My money would never again serve as life support for people who treated me like medical waste. Transaction canceled. The confirmation tone beeped, flat, clinical, final. I opened my email, typed a message addressed to both my mother and Grant. No preamble. No emotional language. A directive. I will never again be the anchor buried in the mud for this family to stand on. All financial support terminates at 12 a.m. tonight. This is not a negotiation. I attached a single PDF, my unclassified military service record. Rear Admiral, United States Navy. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor device. 3 combat deployments. 16 successful high-risk explosive ordnance neutralizations. Every line typeset in government font on bond paper. Within 1 hour, the chain reaction began. My mother's premium credit card declined at a steakhouse in front of 4 women from her book club. Grant's seats, consulting partners, the ones he'd been dazzling with stories of Pentagon access, ran a real background check and discovered he had never held a security clearance, never consulted for any branch of the military, and that his luxury lifestyle had been financed entirely by a sister he'd publicly described as a low-level paper pusher. The creditors who had been circling like sharks smelling chum began making calls. My phone buzzed. Bethany, Grant's wife, who had spent 5 years enjoying spa weekends funded by my hazard pay without once asking where the money came from, called in a state of total collapse. Her voice cracked between heaving sobs. "Emily, please, Grant's partners found everything out. The deal is falling apart. You have to fix this. Tell them it's a misunderstanding." I took a slow sip of water from a bottle on the car's center console. My voice came out flat, smooth, and completely devoid of turbulence. "There is nothing to fix, Bethany. They are stating facts. Only liars are afraid of the truth." I ended the call. Placed the phone face down on my knee. Their empire built on my silence, financed by my blood, decorated with my stolen valor, had officially ceased to exist. The following week, my mother appeared at my office without warning. No appointment, no phone call. She walked past my aide, past 2 security checkpoints, and planted herself in front of my desk with mascara tracks dried on both cheeks and a script she'd clearly rehearsed in the car. No apology for the checkpoint. No acknowledgement of 30 years of humiliation. She opened with the only tool she'd ever mastered, guilt weaponized into a battering ram. One bad night, and you throw away your own family. Your father would roll over in his grave, he'd spit on your arrogance for humiliating me in front of the military. She wasn't done. She pulled out her phone, held it up to show me a text thread. "Grant hasn't eaten in 3 days. His wife is threatening to leave. Are you satisfied? Is this what 20 years of service taught you, how to destroy the people who raised you?" She deployed every weapon in her arsenal: guilt, shame, fear, obligation. She invoked my father. She invoked God. She even threw in a line about how the neighbors were talking. 30 years of gaslighting compressed into a 5-minute monologue performed at full volume in my own office. I did not stand. I remained in my chair, hands folded on the desk, and examined her the way I'd examine a radar contact of unknown intent, steady, patient, waiting for classification. My silence extended. 10 seconds. 20. Long enough for her rehearsed sobs to stutter, skip, and stall out like an engine running dry. She tried one more time. "Say something, Emily. Say anything." I let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, until her hands found nowhere to go, until the performance collapsed under the weight of its own emptiness. Then I rose, turned to my secure cabinet, entered the combination, and removed a single document sealed under a crimson official stamp. I walked around the desk and placed it on the glass surface in front of her. The paper hitting glass sounded like a judge's gavel. You want to talk about Dad? Dad said only things you can hold in your hand have value. Look at what I built with my blood. Her hands shook as she picked up the Silver Star citation. Her eyes, red and swollen, moved across the printed words. Dove into mine-laden waters under direct enemy fire to locate and neutralize multiple explosive devices, directly saving the lives of 11 service members. The document slipped from her fingers and drifted to the desk like a leaf. For the first time in her life, my mother understood that the file clerk she had mocked at Thanksgiving, dismissed at the checkpoint, and thrown in the trash alongside coffee grounds, had been regularly gambling her life against death and winning to produce the income that funded designer wardrobes and Porsche deposits and country club memberships she believed she deserved. I leaned forward. You are not crying because you hurt me, Mother. You are crying because you were exposed. Go ahead and cry, but when you walk out that door, the show is over. She folded at the waist, collapsed into the chair, covered her face with both hands, and wept. Not the theatrical sobbing she'd deployed as a weapon for decades, but the ugly, airless crying of a person who has just discovered that the foundation under their entire life was made of paper. A month passed. Then my mother called. Her voice was barely recognizable, hoarse, stripped, emptied of every note of superiority the way a house is emptied after a foreclosure. She asked me to come to the old house. Just once. Just to see something. I pushed the front door open. The kitchen smelled like dust and cold coffee. She was sitting at the table, both hands flat on the surface, staring at a wooden toolbox in the center. My father's toolbox. It was caked in a 1/4 inch of gray dust, dragged out from the back of a storage closet where it had been sealed since the day he died. Nobody had opened it. Nobody had cared to. I walked to the table, ran my fingers across the lid. The dust was gritty under my fingertips, the wood rough and swollen from years of humidity in an unventilated closet. I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in an oil-stained cloth that smelled faintly of WD-40 and pipe tobacco, I found 2 things. The first was a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle at the edges, from 20 years ago. A small photograph of a young woman in dress whites. The headline, "Local woman commissioned as Navy ensign." He'd cut it out, he'd kept it. Beneath the clipping was a second one, even older, my science fair certificate from when I was 10, the one he'd shrugged at. It was laminated. He'd taken the time to laminate it. The second was a piece of scrap steel, roughly 3 inches long, hammered and bent into the crude shape of an anchor. Etched into the surface with a welding torch in uneven workman's letters that wobbled slightly on the curves were 5 words. Angshore of my life. My daughter. My mother spoke first. Her voice broke on every other word. I found this 3 weeks ago. I was cleaning out the closet because the bank is threatening to take the house. I opened the box looking for tools to sell, and I found this. She pressed her palm against the table. Your father never told me. He never said a word about any of it. He let me believe he didn't care about you either. My father, the blunt-fingered, smoke-stained man who worshipped only what his hands could grip, had seen the steel inside me from the very first day. He had recognized what I was before I did, and he had hidden that recognition in the deepest, most private place he owned, told no one, shown. No one, because tenderness was a language he had never learned to speak out loud. My mother raised her face. Her eyes were nearly swollen shut. She asked a question that detonated 30 years of silence in a single breath. Emily, why did you let me do that to you? Why did you let me treat you like you were nothing? My vision fractured. The tears I had held behind sealed compartment doors for 3 decades finally breached the hull. I drew one long, shaking breath and answered her. Because I took Dad's philosophy and applied it to the wrong war. I made myself invisible so you and Grant could take up all the space. I taught you how to dismiss me. I trained you to believe I was small. There was no accusation in my voice, only clarity. Both of us saw the wreckage at the same time. Sacrifice performed without boundaries doesn't create gratitude. It creates entitlement. And entitlement left unchecked becomes cruelty. Neither of us had been entirely innocent. Neither of us had been entirely guilty. But both of us had been destroyed by the same lie that love means disappearing so someone else can shine. The summer reunion. The living room wall, the one that had been plastered for decades with Grant's track and field ribbons, participation certificates, and a golden plastic trophy from a third-place 50-yard dash, was completely bare. Every pin removed, every nail hole exposed. The wall looked like it had been stripped for renovation, which, in a way, it had. Grant stood on a dining chair in front of that wall, a level in one hand and a hammer in the other. His hands were trembling not from exertion but from something he didn't have the vocabulary to name. Carefully, with the kind of deliberate precision I had never seen him apply to anything in his life, he positioned the frame containing my official Rear Admiral appointment letter and the Silver Star citation, centered it against the wall, and drove 2 nails into the plaster. The sound of steel biting into the wall echoed through the silent house. Every relative in the room, Uncle Ray, Aunt Donna, the cousins who had laughed at me over Thanksgiving turkey, watched without making a sound. Not one of them offered a joke. Not one of them looked away. Next to the framed documents, he hammered in one more nail, a thick industrial nail, the kind my father would have used, and hung the small rough-welded anchor. My father's philosophy and my blood mounted side by side for the first time in 30 years. Grant stepped down from the chair, set the hammer on the table without a word, poured water into my glass with both hands, and sat down with his head bowed so low his chin nearly touched his chest. Not one word of self-promotion left his mouth for the entire evening. The man who had spent his adult life fabricating, inflating, and performing the man who had once told a table full of relatives that admirals called him for advice had finally run out of lines to deliver. Before the meal, my mother pushed herself to her feet. She gripped the table's edge with both hands to keep herself steady. Her voice, when it came, carried across the room with the weight of something that had been locked away for far too long. This is my daughter, a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, a woman who dove into minefields and disarmed death with her bare hands to protect the people who served beside her. For 30 years, I forced her to be invisible. I told her she was nothing. I was wrong. Tonight I am asking her to step into the light, and I am asking all of you to see her the way I should have seen her from the beginning. One introduction, precise, public, honest. It filled a hole that had taken 30 years to carve and only 30 seconds to name. Days later, I stood alone in front of a mirror in my quarters, running my thumb across the star on my shoulder board. The most expensive lesson of a 30-year military career had nothing to do with ordnance or strategy or command. It was this: people can salute you because of your rank. They can follow your orders because regulations require it. But being truly seen, that only happens when the people who are supposed to love you make the deliberate, painful choice to set down their own selfishness and look at who you actually are. Pride does not come from endurance. It does not come from silence. It is born the exact moment you stop protecting other people's lies and start defending your own truth. Unconditional sacrifice does not always produce love. Sometimes it only creates the entitled and the ungrateful people who mistake your generosity for weakness and your silence for permission. That was my lesson. It was paid for in decades of blood-swallowed pride and nights spent defusing bombs, so I could wire the money home to people who didn't know my rank, didn't know my name was on a silver star, and didn't care to ask. If you see yourself somewhere in this story, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments. How did you finally stand up and demand to be seen?